Metroid Prime. Just saying that title excites me. You'd probably find it hard to believe I haven't played it in more than half a decade. I actually meant to cover it on the channel a lot sooner after my initial 2D Quad Trilogy critiques, but better late than never. I've got quite a lot of mixed opinions on this game, stemming largely from my nostalgia, crossed with my more critical approach to making these videos. Metroid Prime was my introduction to the Metroid series, so don't expect an unbiased critique. Not that you should be expecting that from anyone anyway. Metroid Prime is in a fairly unique position in the Metroid series, narratively. The entire trilogy takes place between Metroid 1 and Return of Samus. It's not in your face about it, but if you dig hard enough, you can find lore stating that it takes place shortly after Metroid 1's Fall of Samus. It's neat, but largely inconsequential, other than enabling the use of Metroids for this Metroid game without throwing a wrench into the main storyline. This can easily be taken as an unrelated side series that can be played as a standalone experience. It's honestly one of the best starting points for getting into the series, alongside Metroid Zero Mission and Super Metroid. Incidentally, Prime's opening sequence isn't all that different from Super. Both openings take place in a space station, both involve escaping a self-destruct sequence and chasing Ridley. They're just shuffled around a little bit. Space Frigate Orpheon does a good job laying the seeds for the story beats for the rest of the game, though the execution makes this a bit of a double-edged sword. It starts off well enough, immediately greeting you with a dead Parasite Queen alongside the destruction it left in its wake the moment you enter the station. It does a great job of setting the scene visually, and caps off perfectly with an encounter with that very same creature, but alive, and the subsequent escape. But if you're not doing scans, that's about it. This is where the double-edged sword comes in. For those that take the time to read, you'll find many hints about experiments with a substance called Faison, which is great foreshadowing for the game's, I hesitate to say, central narrative. But for those that don't scan, that's completely lost on them. Without reading the lore scans, this entire opening sequence may as well be entirely inconsequential, because as far as the story is concerned, the plot may as well just be chase Ridley, more or less aiming for a similar story beat as Super Metroid with less competence. Sure, both involve Samus chasing Ridley down to the planet, but why are you chasing Ridley in Prime? To clear out the space pirates, presumably, but that's left largely ambiguous and doesn't really work as a strong hook. Super did this much better. Ridley steals the baby Metroid during your encounter, and the opening establishes the significance well enough that getting said Metroid back is a worthwhile priority. If I'm missing something, be my guest and tell me, but as it stands, Chase Ridley isn't exactly a compelling plot hook on its own. Once your ship lands on the surface of Talon 4, you're more or less left to explore on your own to figure out a path forward, unless of course the hint feature is enabled, which I'd highly advise doing on a first playthrough. And it's great. Even without a strong narrative hook, exploring the environments of Talon 4 on its own is more than enough to draw you in. I don't think it'd be quite as effective if the art direction in this game wasn't so distinct and stunning. Every area, every room in this game is lush with attention to detail. There are rarely two rooms that look alike, which makes navigation a breeze. Each biome, for the most part, has its own array of creatures that rarely feel out of place, unless they're intended to be. While pretty much every creature that you come across is a hazard, most of them are largely harmless and act solely in self-defense, and they're easy to kill for the most part. It captures the feel of the passive creatures from the 2D entries almost perfectly. Aggressive predatory creatures, on the other hand, feel more convincing than the erratic behavior of their 2D counterparts. They come across as appropriately territorial and aggressive, actively seeking you out for entering their turf. Sentient enemies fall into a weird category, though, as up until this point, the Metroid series hasn't really had Samus fight fully sapient creatures outside of boss fights. And the space pirates in, one room in Super Metroid? The X-Clones in Fusion? Space pirates in Prime aren't terribly impressive. This isn't a hard criticism or anything, but knowing space pirates are supposed to be intelligent creatures feels a bit at odds with how they behave in combat. I mean, sure, they duck and weave, use jetpacks to gain the high ground, or cloaking technology and damage immunities, but sometimes it just feels like they're not as aggressive as they probably should be. I'd go as far as to say they're consistently less threatening in Prime than they ever were in the 2D games. I mean, sure, even in those, space pirates were easy to dispatch, but there were still the occasional threats among them, like the silver and gold space pirates from Super Metroid and Fusion, which not even the elite pirates in this game can measure up to. I do like the boss fights in Prime, though. Though less so for gameplay and more for how they play into the game's Faison plotline. Parasite Queen is the result of Faison mutagens being tested in Orpheon. Flagra is a creature gradually changed as a result of exposure to Faison over decades, predating the arrival of the space pirates. Thardus is, rocks that have achieved sentience from Faison for some reason. The Omega Pirate is the result of space pirate self-experimentation taken to an extreme, and Meta Ridley is just Ridley, but with mechanical bits. It does play off the space pirate's experimentation to an extent, but it has basically nothing to do with Faison. And for the game's namesake, the Metroid Prime, it serves as the source of Faison. There's a bit more to Metroid Prime that's really cool in the context of the later games, but as much as I want to talk about that, that's going to be saved for another video. Thardus, feeling horribly out of place aside, the game as a whole does a great job of making it feel like you're gradually chipping away at the Faison corruption on the planet. Don't got a good segue into this, so let's just start by talking about the various areas in Prime. The very first area that you visit is Talon Overworld, which, mirroring Crateria from Super, acts as a safe area to familiarize yourself with your new surroundings. If your Wanderlust leads you to explore a lot before moving on, you'll in all likelihood come across the Impact Crater, an area sealed off by the Chozo, hindering the further spread of Faison, and preventing access to its source. The seal requires a variety of artifacts that have been scattered across the planet and can only be uncovered by following the clues left behind by the Chozo, or by exploring every nook and cranny on the planet. However, while I think encountering this area can leave an impression, I don't think it does a great job of establishing itself as your main goal. At least not at first, and certainly not if you ignore scans. It's not nearly as effective as the statues for Turian and Super Metroid, which signaled you on what you needed to accomplish to get in there. Chozo Ruins is a much more compelling location, and the name alone doesn't honestly leave much for explanation. It's a fragment of Chozo civilization which had lived here mere decades ago, with the structures gradually being eroded by the corruption of Faison and the invasive mechanical infrastructure installed by the space pirates. The effects of the Faison in the ruins are mild at worst. One might not even think twice about it, as it only manifests as poisonous or acidic water. Even scanning the lore could lead one to believe that the water is what the quote-unquote great poison is referring to. This makes for a great red herring that pays off fairly well as the game goes on. Setting aside the core plot, one of the things that I really like about the Chozo lore in this game is their depiction as a technologically advanced race that has since had at least some portion of them isolate on Talon 4 to get more in touch with their spiritual side, and have since left the physical realm, leaving only the remnants of their civilization and tools for Samus, whom was prophesied to arrive and save Talon 4. The series is scarce for lore about the whereabouts of the Chozo, as I recall, but this gives a glimpse into one of the possibilities, and I appreciate it. Though, while on the subject of Chozo, there are things in this game called Chozo Ghosts. Apparitions driven mad by Faison. I dislike fighting these enemies, but I just gotta say, you know a poison is potent when it drives the dead insane. Moving on down, we have Magmar Caverns, which more or less acts as the central hub for the game. The environment itself is a bit lacking in personality compared to the hot areas of Super and Fusion. It feels like the first thing that one would come up with when thinking of a lava level. The caverns just lack any sort of alien feel apart from the creatures living in them. I'm also horribly sick of the theme song because of how repetitive the song itself is, but mostly because of how it was used as the hot area theme in Samus's Returns and was played ad nauseum. Gripes aside, Magmar Caverns isn't without its good points. It does a good job of establishing how deep the space pirate infrastructure runs, with their massive geothermal facilities powering their surface endeavors. Vendrana Drifts is similarly a bit uninspired, at least initially. To put it in the most ungenerous way possible, it's just Chozo Ruins again, but with snow. Vendrana Drifts is where the space pirates and Chozo structures begin to intersect, the region gradually moving from relatively well-preserved Chozo structures to pirate demolition sites, making room for additional research facilities. This is where you encounter your first complete space pirate structure on the planet that's fully explorable. The facility itself has one of my favorite rooms in the game, the holographic display of the local solar system, giving little lore tidbits about the planets they're in, including Zebes, which is pretty neat. Though I imagine to most people the highlight may be your first encounter with the Talon Metroid, who are significantly easier to kill than their SR-388 and Zebes counterparts, being easily dispatched with basically any weapon in your arsenal. That said, Ice Beam and missiles are still super effective against them compared to your other options. More so than before, perhaps, but still. This is the least threatening they've felt in the series so far. This isn't even just limited to these Metroids. This also extends to the Hunter Metroids. Their gimmick is being able to drain you from range, but you can easily hit them and kill them before they even notice you. Vision Metroids are the closest they come to actually being a threat, since they're completely unaffected by Ice Beam and missiles. And once they take enough damage, they split into 2 more Metroids with invulnerability to all but 1 damage type. It's a cool concept, though it's undermined a bit by how easily killed they are by power bombs. I'm not actually upset about any of this, I feel I should mention, it's just stuff that caught my attention. The research facility isn't due too much lore-wise, aside from establishing the Metroid presence and foreshadowing elite pirates, with mentions of their self-experimentation being performed with Faison. For me, the most impactful interaction from exploring the facility is easily the thermal visor. Up till this point, your only visors have been the combat and scan visors, which were neat, but didn't really carry much significance in normal gameplay. From this point on, visors will play a much more noticeable role, primarily in combat, and occasionally for exploration. The thermal visor shouldn't require explanation, it's just infrared vision, and acts as you'd expect. It really shows the attention to detail that went into the world design, like how you can use the visor while in a cold or extremely hot environment, and that'll render the visor pretty much entirely useless for navigation. While in other locations, it may be used to locate platforms that would otherwise be rendered invisible in the dark, like the irradiated mushrooms in the Faison Mines. The X-ray visor, which you find later on, has a similar effect where it allows you to see otherwise invisible creatures and objects. It's useful for navigating more open areas, but is hampered by its limited vision range. I love how the thermal and X-ray visors have downsides to them. There's a problem in a lot of modern games where alternate vision modes can sometimes be overwhelmingly superior to the standard vision in most scenarios. The most noteworthy case for me being Batman Arkham Asylum's detective vision. Having drawbacks is a good way to make the player only use them when needed, as to not distract from the art direction of the rest of the game. The implementation is outright genius in the Prime series, as they never become over or underutilized. I could keep going, but I think you get the point. The one little thing I really love is how you can see Samus's fingers imitating the pose shown on the beam menu while wearing the X-ray visor. It's a lovely touch. Now for arguably my biggest gripe with the game. At this point, if you have the hint system on, the game will direct you towards the crashed Frigate Orpheon from the beginning of the game, which is now submerged in Talonova World. The problem I have is that, as the game's primary water level, it sends you here first for no reason before immediately sending you back to Vendrana Drifts. This isn't like previous instances of backtracking in the game where you at least get a power-up before you get sent back to gain access to another area. No. If you're foolish enough to fall for this so-called hint, you're just sent straight back to Vendrana Drifts to get the gravity suit and you get nothing else to help you get there. You're better off just going there yourself. Knowing this in advance, I circumvented this problem by turning the hints off and using my prior knowledge to seek it out, but for a first-time player, this can easily become tedious. Which is a shame too, because the Crashed Frigate is one of my favorite areas in the game. The music grants the place a tranquil feel alongside the lackadaisical floatiness of the environment. If it weren't for the Aqua Troopers, this place would be almost completely devoid of hostile enemies. And even with them present, it's still a nice, calm stroll before you're sent into the game's most harrowing trial, the Faison Mine. The Faison Mine is far and away my favorite area in the game. It puts pretty much everything you've acquired to the test. It's a heavily fortified base overrun with a variety of space pirates, ranging from troopers immune to all but one beam type, to elite troopers who are effectively mini-bosses, and Metroids, which are all great for ramping up the tension. Though it's not without its issues. Like my problem with the rest of the game, there's not really a narrative through line. Faison is a dominant plot point in the lore, sure, but it's never presented as your goal. As far as the beginning of the game was concerned, the goal was simply to fight pirates and hunt down Ridley. Up till this point, the game has primarily relied on the player's own wanderlust to carry the adventure. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but this does feel weirdly out of place for a series which has traditionally at least had strong hooks to move the narrative forward. The closest Prime gets to that is the artifact hunt, which I'll touch on later. Getting back to the Faison Mine itself, much of its design seems to be to challenge even the most prepared players by having them go through a huge gauntlet of enemies before ever reaching a save station. This is a bit of a double-edged sword, as it can make failure very punishing, but I can't deny that it raises the tension. even with a lot of energy tanks. Though I feel it would have been more effective if the mini-boss before the save station wasn't a bit shite. What you fight is an invisible drone, which in itself isn't too bad, but the inability to lock on does emphasize some of the limitations of the GameCube controls over Wii. Weirdly, this was the hardest fight I had in the game, or maybe my opinion is skewed from this run because I entered with only a few energy tanks remaining. It's not bad, just a bit obtuse, and before anyone says anything, I'm perfectly aware you're supposed to use the wave beam against this. It just kind of slipped my mind in the heat of the moment since I was low on energy. That said, the descent up until this point has been quite engaging. I think the Elite Pirates do a great job of establishing just how far the Space Pirates are willing to go with their self-experimentation. There's additionally multiple logs recalling their attempts to reproduce Samus's equipment, succeeding in the creation of the beam weapons as seen with the Elemental Troopers, and less successful attempts at creating Samus's Morph Ball in a manner I can't imagine is dissimilar from that one bit in Iron Man 2. It's somewhat intimidating, at least narratively, that their experiments proved as fruitful as they did in spite of their destructive nature, which goes a good way in characterizing them as an antagonistic force in a way that wasn't really possible in the 2D games. Right when you think you're about to hit the end of the mine, it instead opens up to a broad tunnel system of Faison, which is bereft of much of pirate structure. These tunnels are overrun with Metroids, which are still hopelessly underwhelming to fight, but I think they at least contribute well to the atmosphere. They pair well with the eerie radioactive glow of the Faison. The highlight of these tunnels for me, aside from the glow of the mushrooms, is how it utilizes all of your visors. From rooms too dark, requiring the use of thermal to firmly make out the mushroom platforms, to invisible platforms calling on your X-ray visor. You'll find yourself actively switching between them multiple times in the same room, which up until this point hasn't really been a thing in the game. After one last push, you eventually find yourself at the very depths of the mine, face to face with the Space Pirates' magnum opus, the Omega Pirate, which is the culmination of all of their Faison research and the result of the Elite Pirate program. Setting aside that it appears to just be using the upscaled model of the Elites with little to no changes on the surface, it still comes across as fairly intimidating. I don't have a lot to say about the fight itself, it's just an upscaled Elite Pirate fight. But the utilization of the X-ray visor to prevent it from regenerating is a cool concept that's relatively well executed. Suffice it to say, I think that the Omega Pirate does a great job as a climax to the Faison Mine. And its death, corrupting Samus's armor with Faison, will continue to stick with me for years to come. This memory, for me, is both positive and negative, as it's both an amazing payoff to the Faison Mine, but also served as the point in my first run over a decade ago where I just found myself asking, what now? Before we move on to the endgame, I want to take this opportunity to go over gameplay elements that didn't really fit well into the rest of the critique, so let's approach in no particular order. I've never been one for 100%ing the 2D Metroid games, or games in general for that matter. It's fun finding power-ups, sure, but some of the hiding places are cryptic and border on bullshit. Over half the time, I'd say that the 2D games do a good job of alluding to the presence of a power-up by adding fine details to make the area feel off, but the rest of the time it's more along the lines of, here's a power-up in a random flat wall, which isn't a method I'm a fan of. Metroid Prime as a series does an infinitely better job of drawing player attention to them, since it's integrated into the exquisitely crafted environments. There are no power-ups hidden in such a way that you wouldn't find a clue of their existence by simply paying attention to your surroundings. Every item is placed with such care that it almost feels like a disservice to not 100% complete the item hunt. This isn't to say 100%ing everything in Prime is fun, though. Scans, for instance, while a great joy to participate in, can be a bit obnoxious in this respect. One thing that really sticks out about Prime is how enemy encounters change as you progress through the game. Previous rooms will be entirely replaced with new sets of enemies, which is a really cool attention to detail that keeps the world from feeling static. But it comes with a drawback. There are, unfortunately, several enemies in the game that are one-off encounters. If you miss them, you might never get to see them again. Parasites from Frigate Orpheon, ice burrowers, ice shriekbats, ice parasites, and ice drones. Oh, sorry, that was aqua drones. It feels like a huge misstep to make standard enemies impossible to re-encounter again if you miss them. I'm just grateful that this doesn't affect the completion percentage that you get for the secret ending. So it's not a make or break issue. Most you're going to miss out on is some concept art. Scanning as a mechanic was a very cool inclusion. I particularly appreciate how not all scans are mandatory for the logbook. The majority, even, are just flavor text to give you additional bits of world building if you're interested enough to read them. The main issue is that the markers for the scannable objects are a bit small and easily missable sometimes as a result. I missed a few lore scans for that very reason. Now let's move on to beam weapons. Rather than stacking beam power-ups like in Super Metroid or Fusion, every beam is entirely independent from the rest. This was technically the case as far back as Metroid 2, but in that game you couldn't freely switch between them. Super technically allowed you to use them individually as well, but it was through the menus, so it wasn't usually incentivized. In Prime, it makes it a lot easier since the GameCube controls allow for easy beam switching during gameplay with the flick of a C-stick, or more clunkily with the directional input of a Wii mode if you're playing in Trilogy. Broadly speaking, the different beams are just keys for different doors. Most instances of combat don't require the use of a specific beam, which is fine by me. I like the versatility of choosing beams based on my own tactical preferences. The standard power beam, for instance, isn't much to write home about. It's generally fairly weak compared to the other beams, even when charged up, but makes up for that with a high fire rate and a very ammo-efficient super missile combo, which I found myself using quite often. Wave Beam, while far from my favorite beam, stands out as the only beam with the ability to interact with the environment via energy nodes, and featuring tracking similar to missiles on its standard and charge shots, making it useful for hitting fast-moving enemies while potentially stunning them, as opposed to its previous iterations that allowed attacks to pass through solid objects, which, well, fair enough. Probably would have been a bit difficult to work that into the combat and exploration. The Wave Buster super missile combo for this beam, however, is fairly lacking. It consumes a ton of missiles and isn't terribly efficient in how much it eats up. It isn't even effective against Chozo Ghosts, so it isn't even good as a Ghostbuster cosplay. Ice Beam remains more or less identical to its previous iterations. It's noticeably slower, but is made up for with the increased potency of the Ice Beam missile combo, not to be confused with the Ice Spreader super missile combo. The Ice Beam combo is basically the classic freeze and missile approach. This combination of attack is supremely powerful in Prime, as it more or less makes most enemies killable in 2 hits, and in what I'd say is a surprisingly brutal and gory way by Nintendo standards. It's extremely satisfying and effective. You'd think it'd be the perfect all-around strategy, but I think the travel speed of the shot itself keeps it from being too heavily relied upon. Personally, more than the beam itself, I adore the Ice Spreader. I don't find myself using it very much, but it's about as useful as the regular super missile. I just love the particle effect. Plasma Beam is probably the least interesting of the alternate beams, lacking its unique property of passing through enemies from the 2D games. It's now just a power beam, but hotter. Gotta say though, the sound enemies make when you kill them with the beam is utterly ghastly, and I love it. Makes it very satisfying to use despite how bland the weapon seems on paper. I think it can more or less become the general use beam once you've acquired it, aside from super missiles. Plasma Beam gets a flamethrower for its super missile combo, which, as far as I'm concerned, has the exact same problems as the Wave Buster without the Ghostbusters appeal, making it infinitely worse. I couldn't even be bothered to get footage of me using it. Not even sorry. Obviously, Visors are far and away the most striking of Samus's new power-ups. I know I touched on this earlier, but I can't get over how well integrated they are into this game. It makes you feel like you're really seeing the world through Samus's eyes, as opposed to being a camera with a gun in traditional FPS. It's organic and fits well into normal gameplay. This really is a system that could have only really worked from a first-person, or I hesitate to say even third-person perspective. We know it isn't great in 2D because the scan visor in Super Metroid wasn't all that much to write home about. Though, who knows, they could prove me wrong in the future. I do want to talk about the Morph Ball in 3D, but honestly there's not much to say. It feels so natural to use that it honestly didn't occur to me when I was writing about this in my original draft. But it is worth talking about. It's incredibly fun and intuitive to use, and that about sums it up. Boost in Spider Ball? Less so. No, I won't elaborate on that. Now, with the cleanup out of the way, it's time we get started on the endgame. I mentioned having issues with the narrative earlier in this critique, right? Well, it's at this point where they become most apparent. For those that didn't already know about the importance of artifacts in regards to finishing the game, either as a result of not taking the lore overly seriously or not having beaten the game before and having the benefit of hindsight, this section can be a bit of a rude awakening. To encounter Ridley, enter the final level, and beat the game, you're required to hunt down no less than 12 artifacts to gain full entry to the Impact Crater. For those already familiar with the hunt, you'll likely have already gotten a few of them as part of your normal exploration and part of your mandatory backtracking for power-ups, and maybe just a teensy bit of late-game cleanup. But for the uninitiated first-time players, this moment is often an unwelcome chore right before the end of the game. I don't think this item hunt is inherently bad, though. It's an issue of implementation, or more likely, communication. Metroid Prime has 3 main driving forces for the narrative, all struggling and mostly failing to become the perceived main objective of the game. The game's intro, as mentioned earlier, while successful in laying seeds for the Faison narrative if you take the time to read, otherwise makes it seem like your ultimate goal was to find and defeat Ridley, which is fine on paper. It worked well enough in the 2D games when accompanied by other space pirate leaders, but in Prime it feels so drawn out and with so little earned build-up that when Ridley finally decides to show up, it's like, oh, okay. Which probably could have been executed better by simply having him appear throughout the game as a looming presence outside of just Vendrana drifts, and having him appear in the lore at all. Which, incidentally, is the second driving force, the lore. Be it Chozo or Space Pirate, it does an incredible job of setting the stage for things to come, foreshadowing many encounters like the Faison Mines, elite pirates, etc. But unless someone actually takes the time to read it, it's entirely possible to miss out on most of its story beats. I know when I was much younger, I couldn't be bothered, even though I enjoy reading these entries now. What annoys me the most is that it does nothing to build up Ridley at all, despite his presence being beaten into your head from the word go. You would think you'd find at least one entry across the space bases, but you just don't find anything beyond Frigate Orpheon in the game's opening. And those aren't even logbook entries. All that said, even though the lore does a great job of compelling exploration forward if it wasn't already doing that on its own for some reason, the part it fails to accomplish is make the task sound surmountable. Everything about the lore makes it sound like you're meant to purge the Faison from the planet. Pretty sure the Chozo lore even says that. It's surmountable because the plot demands it, but it lacks a tangible solution. Metroid 1 and Super had tasked you with eliminating the space pirate presence and the Metroids on Zebes. Metroid 2 with an entire planet of Metroids, and Fusion with the X-parasites on the station. All of which are quantifiable and provide you with clear means to accomplish your task. Ridding Talon 4 of Faison, however, is akin to trying to stop a sinking ship by throwing buckets of water out of its continually filling hull. Even if you get to the source of the Faison, nothing about stopping the source sounds like it could rid the planet of the substance, and eliminating the space pirate presence only sounds like it's putting a band-aid on the problem. Because, well, let's face it, eradicating them from a planet has never once stopped them from coming back before. Looking at you, Zebes. Okay, I lost track of what I was talking about. The third driving factor, or at least I think it was intended to be at one point, considering it blocks you from the final bosses, are the aforementioned artifacts. They're clearly designed as a sort of substitute for the older game's Turian statues, which withheld progress until you defeated the pirate leaders as displayed on the statues. While the artifacts can make themselves known early on, seeing as they're literally 2 doors down from the landing site, they fail to drive home the fact that they're integral to part of your progression instead of an additional step towards 100% completion. I don't think any of these 3 driving factors ever really come together in any meaningful way. Sure, you can bring the artifacts to the Impact Crater to put a stop to the Faison, and Ridley shows up to fight you. On paper, they technically intersect at the same point, and they're all somewhat tied together within the lore. The biggest failing in this is that there's no cohesion between the artifacts and encountering Ridley. With Ridley as the de facto goal, there's nothing at all that would lead one to believe that collecting the artifacts would have any impact on whether or not you'll encounter him. By the end of all of this, every factor feels like a weaker attempt at what was accomplished in Super Metroid. In Super Metroid, when Ridley shows up as a motivating factor, he steals the baby Metroid. The importance of the Metroid is made clear, and getting it back and tracking Ridley feels important. In Prime, Ridley shows up and leaves, and you follow him because it's a space pirate. There's just no clear reason to hunt him down other than for the sake of it. Even after his defeat in Super Metroid, there's still the goal of finding the baby Metroid. But the goal in Prime falls off with Ridley's defeat, presumably down the same pit. The Faison narrative from the lore is the only thing left to carry the torch, and if you haven't read any of that, then the gravity of the impact crater just isn't fully there. That isn't to say the impact crater itself is weak on its own. It's an absolutely enthralling environment. While the Faison Mines felt like something alien encroaching on the familiar, the inside of the crater is completely alien. Overrun with red Faison, glassy mosaic-like tiles on the wall with life forms swimming around inside, monolithic bone-like structures that seem to grow from whatever surface they please, alongside a series of veins of Faison. It evokes the feeling of exploring the innards of a large beast rather than some mere space rock. The music that plays into this environment is perfect, too, feeling like a cacophonous melodic radiation Geiger counter. Yeah, that's a mouthful. It sounds dangerous. It sounds radioactive, and most importantly, it sounds alien. It claws into your head and sticks with you despite its brevity. And one of my friends also suggested indigestion to describe the music, and I can't say I disagree. Ironically, the most unusual thing about the crater are the save and missile stations. Canonically, the space pirates could never get into the crater, so I'm not entirely sure how either of these got down here, unless the titular Metroid Prime nicked them while stealing their technology. Sure, let's go with that. Anyway, after ascending the haunting radioactive fever dream, you finally encounter the titular Metroid Prime. It's hard to set a proper expectation going into this fight, as if you were a fan of the earlier entries, you might have expected something more akin to an Omega or Queen Metroid. Or maybe a large tentacle monster, since that's the path the Hunter Metroids seem to be taking. The Metroid Prime defies pretty much all of these expectations, and appears so wildly different from the species as we know them that it may as well be unrelated. But it leaves an impact. Metroid Prime pulls a lot of its design elements from the elementally charged space pirates, switching between different beam types and only becoming vulnerable to attacks of the same element. It's not overly complicated. You see one phase, you've seen them all, but it's still an exciting fight. I'm especially fond of using the Ice Spreader, the Ice Beam Super Missile combo, against the Metroid Prime. It's just so insanely cool how it can just literally freeze an entire boss like that. It's by far the most satisfying attack to pull off in the entire game, in my opinion, but I digress. The Metroid Prime really does feel like a test of all of Samus's abilities. After you've fully cornered the Metroid Prime and thoroughly broken its exoskeleton, you make your final descent into the core of the crater, and you have your final encounter with the Metroid Prime's core. The Prime core is about as Metroid-like in appearance as this thing gets, taking on a more gelatinous form, while having an oddly humanoid face. This fight is interesting. The core is completely immune to all of your weapons, only being hurt by the Faison beam, which can only be accessed when standing in Faison pools that it creates during the fight. I'm of two minds about this. I like how it disempowers the player by rendering all of your weapons that you're familiar with useless, and empowering you when you use its own power against it. But I don't think that the boss's moveset is diverse enough to warrant how drawn out the fight can feel, because your ability to attack it is shackled to the boss's tempo, rather than your own. It mostly boils down to jumping over shockwaves and waiting for a pool of Faison. The boss doesn't do much beyond that, and summoning other Metroids. It's a shame. I really like the design of the boss, and how it requires the use of the combat thermal and X-ray visor to mirror the previous phase's use of beams. It's not a bad fight, pacing aside. After that, the Metroid Prime explodes, ripping the Faison suit from you in the process. The game just kinda ends abruptly after that. I'm personally kinda curious how Samus managed to escape the radioactive wasteland inside the crater without the Faison suit, but the game doesn't seem too concerned about that, so I guess I won't be either. The end of the game isn't bad, it just doesn't feel particularly impactful. Unless you 100% complete it like I did, in which case you get some bonus foreshadowing, as an eerie hand similar to Samus's emerges from a pile of Faison. I feel like this scene is something a lot of players are aware of because they look it up online, but there is a certain satisfaction to earning it for yourself. I actually recommend 100% completing the power-up collection in this game. It's a lot of fun. So, final thoughts. I think Metroid Prime is a great first stride into 3D for the series. It encapsulates everything that's appealing about the series and adds a lot of its own as well. Even though I think it flounders in its narrative execution, all of the individual elements function well enough on their own to help support the exploration, and the joy of letting Wanderlust take control never really gets lost. Despite its faults that I intentionally blew out of proportion, it's an incredible game and has aged insanely well. I don't think I need to tell you to play this game. If you haven't, you're just wrong. If you stuck with this video to the end, thanks for your time. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Next time, I'll be talking about Metroid Prime 2 unless something goes catastrophically wrong on my end. Have a wonderful night, and I hope this video lit a fire under you. See you next mission.